Okay. Hello and welcome to our lunch study break. It is Wednesday, January 19th, and we are in the Torah portion of Yitro. And so in preparation for today's class, we had a Torah study yesterday morning. So for those of you who are unaware, we have brought back our weekly Torah study, which is now going to be on Tuesdays after our minyan. Our minyan starts at 7:30. So the weekly Parsha discussion I led yesterday. Marilyn Heiss is leading. Rabbi Russell is going to take turns leading. So I want to encourage you all to join us at that. But it's the 10 Commandments, and we've had a lot of conversations about law, philosophy, revelation, and in preparation for what I wanted to teach, I had about 10 things I wanted to teach. So there's almost too much that I want to discuss. And every time I came up with one piece I wanted to discuss, there was something else. So what I want to do is I want to begin by first looking at the 10 Commandments. Just not to do a pshat or a drash interpretation, because that's what we do during our Torah study, but just look at them and just understand them as authority. And then what I want to do is take a look at some modern thinkers and theologians, and in particular, those around our shul and our movement and the conservative movement, in terms of how do they understand authority? What do we make of these 10 Commandments coming from on high? Are they determinative in how we live our lives? And how do we as conservative Jews make sense of that? All right, so let me first begin by opening up to the 10 Commandments. Hold on one second. All right, hold on. That is not what I wanted. That's okay. We will just go to Sfaria. If we go into this week's Torah portion, we get to our Parshat Yitro. And as we discussed yesterday, Moses prepares people of Israel to receive the 10 Commandments. So here they are. Let's just take a look at them. There's a lot of pomp and circumstance in advance of these commandments. Here we've been discussing over the past, my goodness, almost 2 years now. How do we understand God? How do we understand who we are as a community? How do we make sense of all that? Well, here is sort of the big, shiny, you know, what's the fireworks? These are the shiny fireworks. Pay attention to all of this stuff. God spoke all of these words saying, I am the Lord, am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and the fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by God's name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in the 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor your father and your mother, that you may long endure on the land that the Lord God is assigning to you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female slave or his ox or his ass or anything that is your neighbor's. All the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the fireworks, the blare of the horn, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they stood back at a distance and they say, "You speak to us, Moses, and we will obey. But let not God speak to us, lest we die." All right, so we have, here it is, the 10 Commandments. We'll chant them in shul on Shabbat. We'll stand up at the hearing of the giving of the 10 Commandments. Just before we get into the theology, and there's no shortage of it, what do you make of it? What do you make of this ragtag group of former slaves who get to this mountain and who see this thunder and this lightning, and they get these 10 utterances, these 10 commandments? Would you keep them? Would you do those 10 things if you heard them coming out of the sky with a lot of pomp and circumstance? What do you think? I would, just so you know, like, that's fine. I'll keep it. That's good. Good enough for me. Right? Anybody? What are your thoughts? You like these 10 commandments? You think they're good ones? I see some nodding heads. You think that these are, if you were, this is the beginning. This is the, I always like to pull out these 10 commandments. If you really want to know, there's a lot of fireworks that goes on before and after these commandments. There's probably reason to pay attention to them. So all right, just in terms of setting up authority in any structure, the first 2 chapters, the Torah portion is called Yitro, because the first 2 chapters involve Moses' father-in-law setting up the jurisprudential system, saying it's not good for you to adjudicate all these cases. You have to have some sort of system. And now we get the law, the twin tablets. What do we think of them as legislation, as commandments? Any thoughts? Susan and then Marv.
I think it's very hard to look at this from a modern day perspective as opposed to a perspective of 600 BCE or whatever. So I mean, what was the world like then? Were all those things that are being forbidden going on all the time, all around? We don't know. I mean, now ethics can come from within. You can work towards losing your ego, or realizing we're all connected, or any number of practices to naturally not do these things. But then who knows, maybe within that context, it required authority, an authoritarian kind of don't do this or else, in order to.
You need it? You to get people to do it. You might need people to do it. Like, so Rabbi Hirsch points out that this, as a foundation text of law, is different from all of the other cultures and societies, because how do they come up with their foundational texts? A whole bunch of smart people sit around and they think of some good ideas. They're man-made, they're human-made. These are ideas and legislation that does not develop from inside of us. This, of course, is the Hirschian position, and we'll talk more about that, Susan. But it comes from above us, from outside of us, and therefore it has different authority attached to it, is the traditional sense. Marv.
I think it's pretty hard to have a civilization that's going to sustain itself without these following these laws. I mean, today we clearly don't particularly follow these laws. Murder, adultery, stealing, coveting, false witness. I mean, are we kidding? This is the foundation of society, and these things go on all the time. And the question is, are we degenerating? Are we deteriorating and forgetting some of these basic ideas that civilization needs to maintain in order to stop going around and killing each other? I mean, maybe we've made progress. I don't know. If I have my same mantra that I keep repeating is technology keeps advancing, but the human condition never changes. And I assume these laws, of course, were written by man, But what's interesting is if you go back to the beginning of the Parsha, there's no mention of the elders of Israel. I mean, Moses is picking all of these people, but where are the elders? Maybe the elders are a committee making these laws.
So maybe there's a hidden committee behind there somewhere. So Marv, on your point, I was chatting with someone this morning and we were talking about the metaverse, which you might be familiar with, which is sort of the alternative reality or augmented reality. And what about where they put these goggles, the Oculus on you, and then you play video games and you buy stuff. So what about this? You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above or the earth below or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. Well, if I'm in the metaverse and I'm transacting, right? Have I violated that commandment there? I've created a reasonable facsimile of the world as it exists, as it is above, it is below, and then I'm going into that world and dwelling in there. It's like I've turned Plato's allegory into the cave into a real live thing. And it seems that this second commandment is trying to keep us away from that. Susan.
In answer to you, Marvin, I agree that all these things are still being done, but is the answer to have an authority saying you can't do that, or some sort of practice that would enable people to take more control of themselves and stop doing things like this?
That's great. Thank you.
I think that what happens is there are people, the more authoritarian way you're raised, the more chance you're going to break the law, it seems to me, in terms just looking at at the world as it is today in America, let's say. You've got people who are fundamentalists of all kinds who it's just, but you're going to break God's law or you're not. You have to do some sort of practice to really learn to be able to be a mensch, and what is that?
I said this
for
to
some it's God,
think,
but not, for some it's not. So that's all.
No, I think that's exactly right. I said to a friend of mine recently, he was like, well, the 21st century future, he's a conservative rabbi, of course. He says the future of Judaism in the 21st century, it's all Chabad and Orthodoxy. We're dead. 40 years from now, everyone's going to be Orthodox and Chabad. And I said to him, no. I said those are going to have children and they're going to rebel and they're going to have to form a conservative movement or a more liberal movement because they'll be rebelling from that orthodoxy. And it's a continual circle, this idea that, the future is Orthodox. No, because the future is Orthodox and then they'll have children and they'll restart the process again. Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I really like what Susan said, just to elaborate on that. This sets up, maybe that doesn't set up, it's already set up actually even before this, but this is the apotheosis of the system we've inherited, which is that, you motivate through reward and punishment. And it's never really worked for us.
Especially when you're not in a position to be able to mete out reward and punishments. When you don't.
Well, even if you are, right? I think really only in, the last century or so have people who, have we maybe discovered that, maybe this isn't actually the best way to try and govern human behavior, right? And the best way to deal with behavior that we don't like and to encourage behavior that we do like, right? I think probably, the people here, there's a fairly large group of people now who are like, that's not the way that we instruct children, right? Yeah. I think that's fairly widespread now, is the idea that no, we don't rely on certainly physical punishment, right, to instruct children, to get them to behave the way we do want and not behave the way we don't want. And maybe even any kind of system of reward and punishment there doesn't work that well, right? And you could expand that to adults as well. I mean, clearly people are still doing this stuff, right? We've tried for a very long
Yep.
time to punish people who do things we don't like, and
Yep.
not so much to reward people for things that we do like. But this kind of sets up, or is part of the setting up of that rubric, and it doesn't, maybe it just doesn't work.
Interesting. Maybe this dynamic of reward and punishment of the classical biblical theology no longer works in the world today. Marv.
Underlying these concepts, why do we think it's based on reward and punishment? I mean, these concepts that our parents grew up with and that we've inherited over time, these basic ideas, of course.
So these are just truths. These are truths. You're just viewing these are axioms that have been developed over time. They're not necessarily.
Well, I think probably they stand the test of time as well as anything.
But what do we do with them today?
Which one of these would we like to eliminate to have a better society? I don't understand what I
don't think that's not really what I was saying. It's not what we should do. It's in the text, backed up with a threat. That's how it's backed up.
No, I don't see you mean because there's thunder, lightning, and there's this God image that's going to come down and wipe you out if you don't do these?
Stand back. You talk to him. We'll die if we have to talk to this God. You talk to him for us.
Well, I don't see that.
I will punish unto the however many generations. I will reward unto the very many. That's
the sins of the fathers going into the third and fourth generation.
I mean, it's backed up with a system of reward and punishment.
Long life for honoring your mother and father.
Well, I don't. I mean, look, I'm not going to win this if everyone's going to gang up.
No, we're not ganging up. We're just having fun. Lisa, you come in.
But I would like to know which one of these concepts, forget the reward and punishment figures standing out there, which one of these concepts, I guess aside from the first and second, which one of these would we like to do away with in raising our children?
Well, you're not going to get the rabbi to argue. In fact, I'm going to argue that we should really focus in on the first, second, and the third more than we have. Lisa.
So these are very brief statements. They're pretty minimal. There's 2,700 and something pages of Talmud devoted to interpreting what does this mean.
You got it.
And there is immense flexibility and humanism and kindness and compassion in the arguments of the rabbis about how this actually is applied.
So let's get right to that. That's where I want to go. So what I have in front of you now is Emet ve'emunah. This was the statement put out by the conservative movement in terms of how they understood what it is that we stand for. So here it is on Revelation. Conservative Judaism, this is just what do they think about what we just read? Affirms its belief in Revelation, the uncovering of an external source of truth emanating from God. This affirmation emphasizes that although truths are transmitted by humans, they are not a human invention. That is why we call the Torah Torat Emet. The Torah's truth is both theoretical and practical. That is, it teaches us about God and about our role in God's world. As such, we reject relativism, which denies any objective source of authoritative truth. We also reject fundamentalism and literalism, which do not admit a human component in revelation, thus excluding an independent role for the human experience and reason in the process. The nature of revelation and its meaning for the Jewish people has been understood, just as Lisa said, within various ways in the Jewish world and in our conservative community. We believe the classical sources of Judaism provide ample precedents for these views of revelation. The single greatest event in the history of God's revelation took place at Sinai, but was not limited to it. This is Lisa's point. God's communication continued in the teaching of the prophets, the sages, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Halacha, the Agadah, the Teshuvot, the codes. Some of us conceive of revelation as a personal encounter between God and human beings. Among them, there are those who believe that this personal encounter has propositional content, that God communicated with us in actual words. For them, revelation's content is immediately normative, as defined by rabbinic interpretation. The commandments of the Torah themselves issued directly from God. Others, however, believe that revelation consists of an ineffable human encounter with God. The experience of revelation inspires the verbal formulation by human beings of norms and ideas, thus continuing the historical influence of this revelational encounter. Others among us conceive of revelation as the continuing discovery through nature and history of truths about God and the world. These truths always are culturally conditioned, are nevertheless seen as God's ultimate purpose for creation. Proponents of this view tend to see revelation as an ongoing process rather than as a specific event. So in terms of what is the conservative movement, think about those 10 utterances, those 10 commandments we just read. What do you think about that statement that they just put out there about revelation? Yes, Susan, you go right ahead.
Well,
They say everything. Sorry, go.
they say everything if you're conservative.
It all goes. It's all kosher, Susan.
But it doesn't work for people who are not. That's all. I mean, I think that people can lead a moral life without the rules issuing from God, without even believing in God, and that might. And I mean, I'm reading a book right now that's about Stoicism, Buddhism, and Judaism, and I find it really interesting. I'm more in a middle way position. I mean, I don't deny there's God. I don't know if there's God. I'm kind of agnostic, as Sherwin-Lyon called it. It's irrelevant. But I get really uncomfortable when I'm told that if you don't believe in God, then you can't follow moral law.
What about this approach here? Some of us believe in God, some of us believe in nature.
Yeah, that's good. That works for me. But I do believe that the rabbis have a lot to say, as Lisa was talking about.
Yeah.
That's
We'll
really
get there,
important
sure.
for Judaism. That's really where it's at, is what the rabbis had to say, and they vary a whole lot. And they model for us this amazing ability to continue to not have certainty, to not declare the truth. They don't do that. It's not like, looking at the 10 commandments and saying, this is it, this is the truth. They're not like that. They argue and argue. They even respect people who are, apicorus, as they would call them. They take it all in, and that's what I think that's the greatest model of what.
So that's exactly right. So if God, it can be from God, it can be from nature, it can be from morals, it can be unfolding. You can have a different idea from me, you're a rabbi, I'm a rabbi. We can agree that we have different approaches. Great. How do we have a community, and how do we make decisions? What do we do now? I think that's where I want to take this conversation. Is how do we take it to the next step? Marcia.
Well, that's exactly where I was getting at. You look at these laws that came up. There's a group of people that perhaps are accepting this reality, this sense of reality, and they're owning this sense of shared belief system. And so they can talk among themselves because they have a shared belief system. They can hear what the other guy says because they're thinking that that person has the shared view of the world, the shared belief system. And where we are right now, at least in this country, and it seems like
Yes.
all over the world, is there doesn't seem to be a shared belief system. So people are talking past each other because there isn't a set of building blocks that we share. And so no truths are self-evident, period.
That is perfectly said. Amen. And it is descriptive of the world in which we live. And that's why, so what I'm going to go here into, we're going to go from, so let's take a look at Jewish law. So how does the conservative movement in this document figure it out? Well, so they have halacha constitutes the norms taught by the Jewish tradition, how one is to live. Since each age requires new interpretations and applications of the received norms, halacha is an ongoing process. It is thus both an ancient tradition rooted in the experience of our text and a contemporary way of giving life. For many conservative Jews, halacha is indispensable first and foremost because it is what the Jewish community understands God's will to be. Moreover, it's a concrete expression of our ongoing encounter with God. Now, but as Marcia says, well, this isn't going to work if I think one way, Susan thinks another way. How are we going to have a meeting of the minds here? This divine element of Jewish law is understood in varying ways within the conservative community. But however the theology is understood, it is for many the primary rationale for obeying halacha. Other considerations complement the theological basis for halacha. So they gives other ways in which we can understand it. But basically what they tried to write is that halacha is, in its developing form, is an indispensable element of a traditional Judaism that is vital and modern. All right, so not a great, if I might be honest, not really descriptive at all in telling me what halacha is. It just sounds like it is whatever they're saying it is at the moment. And that's why I wanted to pull in a different article here that I think is a little bit more narrow and on point to help us try to get at, oh, that's not what I wanted. Try to have us get at, hold on one second. Sorry, I went in the wrong direction. Perfect, great. All right, so here, authority and parameters in Jewish decision-making. So Rabbi Gilman here, my professor, is going to try to understand basically what we've been discussing here, Marcia and Susan, is where is the authority? So the first question is, what is the authority of Torah in our lives? I mean, is it determinative? Do we have to keep it? How do we decide that? Rabbi Gilman says, from a theological perspective, the basis for determining the authority of Torah in matters of belief and practice rests on how we understand these 10 commandments, this revelation. Regarding revelation, he says there are only two possibilities. We can disagree with that if we want to, but he's going to give us two possibilities. There's the traditionalist position and the liberal. The traditionalists insist that there is a tight congruence between what God wants us to know of God's will and what the Torah tells us. The liberal insists that no such congruence exists, that there is a gap between whatever God revealed and what is recorded in the Torah. All right, so basically what that means is the traditionalist says this comes from God, and therefore it is determinative, period, the end. That's where it comes from. Because this gap for non-fundamentalists or non-traditionalists, this gap between God and us remains unsolvable, right? I think for a lot of us, this idea that God wrote these distinct commandments is something we might have some questions about. It becomes very hard for us to bridge that gap and to ascertain what the authority then is, or where to find the authority. So Norman Lamb, who you've heard me talk about, who was the head of Yeshiva University, one of the clearest exponents of the traditionalist position, insists that God willed that man abide by his commandments, and that will was communicated in discrete words and letters. God wants us to do something, and God told us with alphabet and with words and with letters and with sounds put together. Rabbi Lamb says that the divine will, if it is to be made known, is sufficiently important for it to be revealed in a direct, unequivocal, and unambiguous manner as possible, so that it will be understood by the largest number of the people to whom it's addressed. Obviously, it's God. God is going to communicate God's will in a way that people can hear it. Obviously, God's God. So Rabbi Lamb accepts unapologetically the idea of verbal revelation of the Torah. So these 10 commandments that we just read come directly from God, and to deny that God can make God's will clearly known is to impose upon God a limitation of dumbness that would insult the least of his creatures. Finally, given the above, it is clear that I regard all of the Torah as binding upon the Jew. So what Rabbi Gilman says, in short, if God cares enough to give us the Torah in the first place, we must assume that God has the power to communicate precisely what God wants to know. To deny this is to deny God's power. In fact, to deny God. So for the traditionalists, the criteria for authenticity in Judaism are therefore halachic and theological. It follows that halachically correct conversions performed by liberal rabbis are not acceptable to the traditionalist Jew because they follow the halakha for the wrong reasons, he says, not as revealed by God in distinct letters and words. Okay. That is the traditionalist approach. All right, we know about that approach. So he's now going to try to give another approach here, which is the liberal position. Let's see if we like this one any better. Abraham Joshua Heschel writes that as a report about Revelation, the Bible itself is a midrash. So in doing that, he takes a decisive step out of being a traditionalist. He further concludes that what reached the ear of man was not identical with what has come out of the spirit of the eternal God. That Judaism is based upon a minimum of revelation and a maximum of interpretation, and that the source of authority is not the word of the text, but it's our understanding of the text. If the words of the Torah are not God's words, then they must be human words. There is no middle ground here, Heschel says here. And I think based upon what we're hearing is, if I had to put us into a big box, I'd put us into the second box. From what I'm hearing here, for the most part, I think a lot of us are, I don't know, perhaps not literalists or fundamentalists. And what we've shared here is that it's the beauty of Judaism is the 1,000th years of interpretations and questionings and debate and arguments and interpretations. And all of that stuff is the beauty of what it means for halakha, for Jewish law to be. It's not about the discrete words. We're not strict constructionists. If anybody ever went to law school, we're not locked into the original text, according to the liberals. Of course, the traditionalists wouldn't like that. Ben.
So as revelation, the content of the 10 Commandments is pretty lame.
Is lame?
Yes. There's nothing there that those people haven't already figured out. There's nothing there that they don't already know. So as the communication of the will of God, it seems like God could have gone a little further in making that clear. If what Lamb is saying is that of course God can make clear what God's will is, either God's will is very, very limited in terms of what God wants us to do, or maybe revelation, maybe something happened there, right? And maybe there was some kind of revelation, but and maybe it's more in terms of the style than the substance, right? Or something happened that at the same time of the giving of the commandments that was very, very special. But when I look at the text, right, it like I said, what is there that wouldn't already have been known, right? People already knew about Shabbat. People already knew that it probably wasn't a good idea to kill each other and steal from each other and sleep with each other's wives, right? People already had an idea about honoring their parents. So this seems like documentation, right? This seems of and codification of a set of practices. But yeah, in terms of, well, this is God brilliantly communicating God's will, I don't see it.
Well, it's a lot of pomp and circumstance for things that we already know. Right?
Yeah. So maybe the content isn't the point. Maybe, like I said, maybe there's something else going on there.
Well, that's what Heschel.
But I don't see it in the text.
That's Heschel's point. Heschel's main point is that the only thing we know is that God communicated with us. Everything else is just interpretation, because we can't know what left God's intention, because that's beyond us by definition. So therefore, it's all just midrash. Something happened. That's what you're saying. The pomp and circumstance, the lightning, the thunder, that all took place, perhaps. But what matters is that there was that connection, that happening matters. And there are many Jewish thinkers who say that revelation mattered, basically taking that Heschel point of view. Revelation happened, but we have to then explain what to make of that. And that is very much the Heschelian point of view. Don.
Yeah, hi. So I was seeing that, so God gives the revelation, and it's huge. So we step back because we can't confront it. And so I'm wondering why, if we were there, and I'm talking for us, I think we were there personally. That's my personal opinion, that each one of us was there. And God, the God that we pray to every week at temple, and that we believe in, or some of us, whatever. And God is right there in present moment, right there, not theoretically, not from Torah, because Torah's not done yet, right? So we're having the experience. Why do we step back? And I think that is, why did we step back? What is it in us that if God were in front of us, that we would have to step back, that we couldn't just walk into the light, so to speak, and commune with God? Why did we step back? What was going on with us? So I'm trying to throw it back on us to get it off of God.
It's so interesting for you to pick that out, because there's something I wouldn't pick out, because it seems to be the most natural thing to take a step back. Oh my God, the mountain's on fire. It's steaming. I got voices coming from the sky. There's this supernatural being, right? If a space alien landed in Golden Gate Park, I wouldn't run to the space alien. But I'd be terrified.
But that is the God. It's not like a space alien. It's not terrifying. If it's God, it is our Father. So what is it? If it's our Father, what is it that we find so terrifying?
Well, the show. So, I mean, I think now I'm getting, the show is terrifying. And your question is why, if God is our Father, Avinu Malkeinu, right? Why does God put on that show? Why doesn't God give us the commandments with a hug, right? Why doesn't God give us the commandments in a different fashion? Why do it in this Egyptian show of power way that we see here?
Also, last thing I just would say, I remember in Deuteronomy, he does put the Torah in our heart, or the laws in our heart, correct? So maybe he had to do it there to get our attention, whatever. I don't know how it works, but in
different writer, different author. If you really want to break it down, it's
end,
you want to break it down, it's a different author. It's the Deuteronomist. It's Moses who's saying, you know what, you're really going to have to put this in your heart. You're going to have to circumcise your heart and let this come into it, because as legislation, it's interesting. As legislation, it's, legislation is not going to hold. It's only going to hold as if it becomes a virtue theory, where you've now embedded these virtues into who you are, where it's not some written algorithm or this calculus that you have to put to every circumstance, but it's a natural outflowing from inside of your heart. That's Moses, that's his sort of chop to a certain extent. And you get a lot of that in the Deuteronomist, but people do believe that's a different author there. Let's go on a little bit more into the liberal perspective. Woman writes that I chose Heschel as representative of the liberal camp because he is commonly identified with the more traditionalist wing of modern Jewish theologians. Even stronger cases can be made for the liberalism of Rosenzweig and Buber. Rosenzweig claims that God came down on Sinai. This already concludes the revelation. God spoke is the beginning of interpretation, right? Just what you're saying, Ben. Once you put words, God spoke, you're already interpreting. And certainly I am is an interpretation. Buber even rejects Rosenzweig's suggestion that God is not a lawgiver, but he commands, right? Even Buber says that might be too much. In these statements of the liberal position, the human community does not possess God's explicit will. In Heschel, because God's will has to pass through the screen of human comprehension and language. And in Buber and Rosenzweig, because God does not explicitly reveal God's will in the first place. In Mordechai Kaplan's thought, the liberal position reaches its most radical conclusion. For Kaplan, God's will is thoroughly identified with the human community's discovery of salvational patterns in human beings and in nature. In short, for Kaplan, God wills whatever the human community says God wills. Basically, it's the individual communities. So Ben, the board, we all, the millionaires, we'd all would get together if we were a Reconstructionist community, and we would have a talk and we'd have a conversation and we'd determine for Beth Shalom what God's will is. And we walked in here, it would be by mutual assent. This is God's will, because God's will is determined by how the community interprets and understands God's will to be. But in principle, Gilman says the same claim can be made for Heschel, for Rosenzweig, for Buber, and basically he's saying for the conservative movement too. This illusion from Emet ve'emunah that I started with, that we have this halachic jurisprudence, Gilman calls that into question, because he says in all of these formulations, the human community determines the content of Torah and becomes thereby the locus of authority. That is the distinguishing mark of all liberal theologies of revelation. The liberal approach to defining authority is evident in Solomon Schechter, who claims that it is not the mere revealed Bible that is of first importance to the Jew, but the Bible as it is interpreted by tradition. He continues, it follows that the center of authority is actually removed from the Bible and placed in some living body, this is Schechter, which by reason of its being in touch with the ideal aspirations and the religious needs of the age is best able to determine the nature of the secondary meaning. All right, so there's some body that's going to determine the secondary meaning of these words, and Schechter referred to that body in a very unfortunate phrase, never really stuck, called Catholic Israel. Catholic meaning the whole of Israel, Catholic Israel, the consensus shaped by committed Jews in any one generation. Catholic Israel, this is where Schechter stands for in conservative Judaism. If you're wondering where conservative Judaism comes from, it comes from this Catholic approach, which is determined by the general consensus of committed Jews in this generation. God may have chosen the Torah, Moses, and Israel, yet God's choice invariably coincides with the wishes of Israel. This striking formulation surely helps us understand why in 1909 Schechter was perfectly comfortable in inviting the young Mordechai Kaplan to teach in his school. Okay, so any questions with regard to these sort of two key positions, the liberal and the traditionalist approach here? Susan.
Actually, I don't have a question, but I think it's really an interesting idea what Schechter says and what Kaplan says. It's And it's something you'll see like in Klal, you know, the organization that brings together people from different
Sure.
denominations that Yitz Greenberg started, where everybody can explore, you can explore these ideas from any vantage point. And it's very, whether you believe we're created in God's image or you believe that human beings, the God idea, or
But what do I serve for lunch after the service on
right.
Shabbos?
So for someone like me, I, having been raised Orthodox and saw how I couldn't really interact with other people because I couldn't eat with other people, my bias is going to be not halachic. And my orientation when I study is to look at Talmud, not Shulchan Aruch, which is way, the rabbis would be rolling over in their graves, in my opinion, if they saw that book. So
You've led services.
oh yeah, for
Okay.
5 years. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. And how did you decide what food you were going to serve after the service ended? How did you decide what liturgy was going to be in the service?
The liturgy is fairly, it's what we had actually a liturgy committee. All the people in our congregation were humanist Jews who wanted to be Jewish, but they couldn't do it in a traditional place. For someone like me, I didn't do Judaism anywhere because once I left Orthodoxy, there was nowhere to go. And then I discovered Humanistic Judaism. So we say words that we believe, but we love being Jews and we love Jewish culture. And we find ways very similar to Mordechai Kaplan's ideas, only we take it a step further. We don't use the prayer as folk custom. We write our own words.
Perfect. So it's very much, not strict Kaplanian, but very much in the ethos of Reconstructionist, which is who determines what God's will is? We do. The people showing up in shul determine what God's will is, and we'll create committees to decide which liturgies we're going to use. And
we don't even talk about God's will in our community.
We just talk about what we want to do and how to be.
What's the right thing to do? Whatever,
So, okay, great. So let me ask you or whomever wants to answer this question. So great. So that is the quintessential Reconstructionist model, like par excellence, as Ben experienced at SAJ on the Upper West Side, that the community comes together and decides what's good. God, according to Kaplan, is the power that makes for salvation. So the people have to decide what's going to make this community achieve salvation, right? What's the right food for us to eat and how are we going to appeal to the folk ways or the old mitzvot. Okay, but now my question becomes, you have this one approach, this liberal approach, which you're describing, and then you have the traditional approach, which Rabbi Lam is describing, which is it comes from God. Okay, God said, don't eat shellfish, so don't eat shellfish. That's the authority there. Okay, so those are the two sides. Me, my shul, the conservative movement, we want our cake and we want to eat it too. And I'm curious, does any of it fly? Does any of it work for anyone? Is there a coherent halachic jurisprudence? No, I meant for emunah, I found very disappointing. It doesn't really give me much there. Is there a way that when you come to Beth Shalom, or when you pray, or when you participate in a type of Judaism that is neither totally human-made, the approach of a collective conversation, and neither totally distant and some authority on high? Lisa, and then Ben. Well, you're muted, Lisa. You're still muted. Sorry.
Sorry. I think it's really difficult to use the words God's will. I don't know what that means. I don't know how anyone can know what that means. Halakha, what does it literally mean, halakha?
The path, the way.
That's right. That's what it means.
So, Okay, but okay, fine. But what kind of cheese do I serve? Do I, how do I make some of these decisions according to the halacha?
So
And I think, yeah,
do we want a civilization without guideposts?
say that again.
Guideposts. Without a blueprint. We have it right now. Look at what happened to us.
When every man is a king in his own eyes. That's right. That's right.
It has been an unmitigated global disaster. So
we have this, we take authority into our own hands. We think that we can be like Icarus and fly to the sun and not have to worry about anything. And as a result of that, we fall apart as a society. So it's not totally human made. It's not totally created by our own best intentions and committee. And it's not probably verbatim from God either, but it is some sort of revelation. I think you're like Heschel here, that says there is a God and there are some guideposts here, and we're going to do our best to make sure that we live a life within them. All right. That's better than, by the way, Lisa, that's better than Emunah, by the way, in my opinion. I could sell that.
and
I could sell.
when Heschel was asked to define what kind of Jew he was, he said, I am not a noun in search of an adjective. He's a Jew.
That's right. Catholic Israel. He is a Jew. He is a part of the entire, well, it's not a great phrase, but he is a part of the entire generation. The Catholic in the sense as a noun meaning of the whole. Ben.
Well, to answer your question, works for me.
Why? Wait, because you don't need it to be consistent. You don't need that logical integrity. What?
No, not really. I enjoy being part of a community and a tradition which says that they're all live options, right? They may not, maybe something's true and something's not true, but given our ability to know and understand, let's just treat these things as all live options and behave as if they were all live options. I think it's possible for us to be able to keep more than one thought in our head at the same time, and more than one truth in our head at the same time. And I think so far in our community, it hasn't, we've been able to come together around that kind of idea, I think, pretty well. So yeah, it works for me.
So the first article that I wanted to share when I started to prepare for this class, we never got to, because I just thought it was just going to be too boring to do. But Ben, you really touch on it right there. And so the article here comes from the chancellor of the seminary, Isamar Shorsh. And this is his inaugural address that he gave when he was installed as the sixth chancellor of the seminary. And ultimately, I decided not to teach this today because I thought it would be slightly dull. But he says here exactly what you say. Nothing is more urgently needed today, I believe, than the courage to reaffirm the authenticity of a Judaism which is not one-dimensional. We live in an age of excess in which moderation is shredded on the ragged edges of polarization. We tend to do everything beyond, we tend to do everything beyond measure. And then behold, with dismay, that justified revulsion leads to unbridled reaction. All right. So what I wanted to share is that ultimately it's this plurality. Jewish thinking and living can only be adequately understood in terms of a dialectic pattern containing opposite or contrasted properties. As in a magnet, the ends of which have opposite
Did we lose the rabbi?
That's why I opened.
All
That's
right.
why. Am I here now? You can hear me, right?
Yeah, we lost you there for 30 seconds.
Yeah, my computer crashed. Okay, so we're gonna end it. We'll have this meeting from here then, and we'll be looking at this indefinitely. So what? Oh, good. So that's gone. Okay, so hold on. So the point that Heschel was making there was that it's both. It is both God wrote verbatim these words, and it is both upon us as human beings to determine the will of God. These two ideas, Rabbi Gilman referred to Rabbi Schorsch refers to them as a stereophonic Judaism, which is antiquated, I guess, 1987. But the idea comes from Maimonides, which is he wrote two key texts. The one is the Mishnah Torah, which is the legal text of laws, and the other one is the Guide for the Perplexed, which is the deep theological philosophical text. You need, according to Schorsch, both of those. And we have to learn how to live in that stereophonic world in which we have these two ideas going on simultaneously. That I love as an idea. Hasn't really caught fire homiletically, but I really find that very meaningful, because one of the things that I've been just coming to learn is that people process things, especially as a rabbi, people have different neuro processing power. People see things differently. People hear things differently. When this Torah, the 10 Commandments, are given at Mount Sinai, it says everybody heard in their own way and in their own understanding. And anytime we say it has to be one way or the other, we're going to be in mono, and we're not going to get the full picture. So I wanted to just share that with you, a little bit of a hodgepodge. But what I wanted to get to was that stereophonic idea that Ismar Schorsch comes down to. This idea that both, God gave us the commandments at Mount Sinai and gave it to us in distinct letters. And the other one is, yes, ultimately, God, we have to determine the will of God for ourselves. Thoughts? Don?
Yeah, I love the stereophonic concept, but it would seem that it'd be hard to ground through that. That as human beings, we want to ground through one thing. This is the way. So when you were saying that, I was processing it going, yeah, I agree with it. But it's like, but who do I say I am?
That's right. What do we do? What do we do? What's the prayer that we read? What do we eat? Do we eat meat? How do we make practical decisions? And I think that ultimately sits at the heart. Right. So Susan and her community, that works. You can see that's going to be super effective. People are going to come together. They'll argue, they'll disagree, they'll hate each other, but they'll have some document at the end of it that decides what they're going to keep to. Orthodox, Rabbi on high says, this is what it is. That works. Us, we want our cake and we want to eat it too. And it makes it more challenging to be able to have concrete authority when you sit in that middle space. So we're about at time here, but I wanted to just, because it's one of the things that gets thrown at me all the time, especially when you have the 10 Commandments. God says on high, this is what you do. How do you understand that, Rabbi? And I like to say that we can deal in the mystery. We can deal with both in that stereophonic way. Both, the world was created for me and I'm nothing but dust and ashes. Both, I'm an animal from the earth. I have blood and I need air. I'm a flesh and blood. And the other one is I'm a spiritual creature, and holding both of those. And I think in the world that we have now, is who was telling us, who was Lisa, the world is not in the best of shape. It's because we have a hard time holding those two oppositional things at the same time. Now, I'll close with this one final thing, because it's right on point. It has to do with John Stuart Mill. I called up my professor from law school, Jesuit priest, a professor of medical ethics in Boston. And I called him up about a year ago after the pandemic. And I said, because I studied legal medical ethics with him. And I said, what's the deal? What's going on with the pandemic? How do we understand everything? And he said to me, all that John Stuart Mill, all of that utilitarianism, all of that individual stuff, you have to throw that out now. It's all passé. You live in a new world. This is the 21st century. Mill is no longer applicable. And I'm like, oh my God, that is intense. And yet we are, and yet there's part of that is truthful. So this is the conversation that continues to happen. And as I ramble a little bit, as I try to talk into my phone, I just want to thank you all for coming and going through the 10 Commandments, trying to understand where they come from, what our authority is for them today, and hopefully, as we've all said here, keeping both our insight, our intellect into asking what is the best will for us, if it's not God's will, while also understanding that it all doesn't come from us. All right, I will leave you with that. I'm sorry my computer crashed along the way and you had to get this close up of me, but I look forward to seeing you next week. Next week is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is January 27th. I was thinking about doing this. Do you think this will fly? Do you think Hannah Arendt would fly in this group? What do you guys think? Not so sure.
I would love that.
Oh, okay, we good. So I think about maybe we'll do a little Hannah Arendt and see if we can understand that. It's a little hard to read though. And it's hard to read. It's challenging stuff to read for sure. Lisa.
We can deal.
That's the beauty of this group, is I think we can deal.
Especially after the latest news about who turned in Anne Frank. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't see that. I saw that was on 60 Minutes. Who was it?
They're pretty sure it was the head of the Jewish Council.
That's not surprising. Actually, that's sort of public human nature in all circumstances. You have a choice, and your choice is, I'm going to snitch on these other people. And he made not necessarily personally that was the Franks, but I'm going to snitch on these other people to save myself. And you hear that over and over and over again across all cultures. And it takes a really super special person, of which we don't have a lot, who sacrifices himself for the better of others.
I still hope it's not true.
I'm sure, I have a sense that it is. Anyone who puts themselves on those committees in the first place, they had a pattern all along of picking the people who would go to be exterminated. So, they got good at it.
And Hannah Arendt she's attacked.
Oh, yes, she was very critical.
Yeah.
She was very critical of those people that Marcia is talking about. All right, so we'll take a look at that next week in commemoration of International Holocaust
It's
Remembrance
actually
Day.
timely. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.